I sat in my Manhattan penthouse sipping black coffee while the television broadcast the royal wedding of the century. My younger sister Melody was about to marry Prince Harrison of Cordovia. I was watching it on a screen because just 48 hours earlier, she had looked me in the eye and told me my very existence was a stain on her new aristocratic aesthetic. I took another sip of coffee, feeling absolutely nothing for the girl in the white gown. Suddenly, a heavy, sharp knock echoed through my living room. I set my mug down and walked to the entryway, expecting a package delivery. Instead, when I opened the door, I found two men standing in my hallway, wearing the ceremonial uniform of the Cordovian Royal Guard. The taller one stepped forward and bowed his head slightly. Miss Williams, his voice was thick with a European accent. His Majesty King Edward requests your presence in Cordovia immediately. A private jet is waiting on the tarmac. I am Audrey, 33 years old and a senior forensic accountant at one of the top financial auditing firms in New York. Before I tell you exactly how my sister's royal fairy tale turned into an international financial scandal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family member that financial independence is the ultimate crown. It all started 48 hours before that knock on my door. I had just arrived in Cordovia, a small but incredibly wealthy European principality known for its pristine banking sector and old money prestige. The flight from New York had been exhausting, but I pushed through the fatigue. I was there to fulfill my duty as the older sister. I checked into the Grand Cordovian Hotel, a sprawling palace of marble and gold leaf that the royal family had entirely booked out for the wedding guests. I was placed in a modest suite on the fourth floor, which was perfectly fine by me. I was unzipping my garment bag, carefully hanging up the tailored navy suit I planned to wear to the rehearsal dinner when my hotel room door flew open. Melody stormed into the room without knocking. At 28, she was the undisputed golden child of our family. She had spent her entire adult life chasing wealthy men and curating a fake socialite persona on social media. Now she was dressed in a silk robe that cost more than my first car, her hair perfectly highlighted, and her fingers heavy with diamonds she had not paid for. She marched straight up to me and threw a crisp white envelope directly at my chest. It hit my collarbone and fluttered to the carpet. "Pick it up!" she demanded, her voice dripping with venom. I looked at the envelope, then calmly bent down and picked it up. Inside was a one-way economy class ticket back to John F. Kennedy International Airport, departing in 3 hours. I looked back up at her, my expression completely blank. "What is this, Melody?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is your ticket out of my life," she sneered, pacing across the expensive Persian rug. "You are an embarrassment, Audrey. Look at you. You are 33 years old, unmarried, and you spend your entire life staring at spreadsheets. You have no style, no grace, and no understanding of high society. You are socially unfit to be around the people I am marrying into." I stood there absorbing the sheer audacity of her words. I had spent the last decade bailing our parents out of debt, paying for Melody to have nice things, and working 80-hour weeks to build a solid career. My firm actually audited the Central Bank of Cordovia, but I kept my professional achievements quiet because our parents always told me not to overshadow Melody and her pursuit of a good husband. "I am your sister," I said simply. "I flew across the ocean to support you." "I do not want your support!" Melody laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "I am entering the highest level of European aristocracy. The king and queen value pedigree and elegance. I cannot have them seeing my spinster sister looking like a middle-class corporate drone in the background of my wedding photos. You do not fit the royal aesthetic. You are boring and plain. I want you on that flight back to America before the rehearsal dinner begins. Do not show your face at my wedding." Before I could even process the absolute finality of her rejection, her eyes darted to my neck. I was wearing a delicate vintage diamond pendant on a thin gold chain. It was the only heirloom our grandmother had left behind, and she had specifically given it to me before she passed away, because she knew Melody would pawn it for shopping money. Melody stepped uncomfortably close to me, her eyes gleaming with greed. She reached out and forcefully yanked the chain. The gold snapped with a sharp, tearing sound, scraping against the back of my neck. I gasped, stepping back as she clutched my grandmother's diamond in her manicured fist. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice finally rising. "Give that back to me." Melody slipped the diamond into her pocket with a self-satisfied smirk. "Do not be ridiculous, Audrey. A piece like this belongs on a future princess, not a spinster accountant who sits in a cubicle all day. Consider it your wedding gift to me. Besides, you will not be needing it on your miserable flight back to New York. Have a safe trip home, loser." She turned on her heel and strutted out of the hotel room, letting the heavy oak door slam shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Any other sister might have collapsed onto the bed in a puddle of tears. Any other person might have screamed or chased her down the hallway to fight over the stolen necklace. I did neither. I walked over to the bathroom mirror and looked at the angry red mark forming on the back of my neck where the chain had snapped. I touched it gently, feeling a profound shift happening deep within my chest. I had spent my entire adult life dimming my own light so my sister could shine. I had funded the illusion of our family wealth with my hard-earned salary. I had swallowed every insult, every backhanded compliment, and every blatant display of favoritism from our parents, because I believed that family was supposed to stick together. But as I stared at my reflection, the illusion completely shattered. They were not my family. They were parasites who had fed off my stability to build a house of cards. Melody thought she had just won. She thought she had successfully discarded me like trash while stealing the only piece of family history I cherished. She thought she was untouchable because she was marrying a prince. She had absolutely no idea that she had just declared war on a forensic accountant. I did not cry. I did not panic. I simply turned away from the mirror, grabbed the room key, and headed downstairs to the hotel lobby. I was going to find my parents, Brenda and Gregory. I needed to see if they would finally stand up for me, or if they would prove to be exactly the monsters I was beginning to suspect they were. I stepped out of the elevator into the cavernous lobby of the Grand Cordovian Hotel. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. Wealthy guests mingled in designer clothes holding crystal flutes of champagne. The air smelled of fresh lilies. I spotted my parents immediately. Brenda and Gregory were holding court near a grand piano. My mother wore an emerald green gown. My father stood beside her holding a Scotch glass projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch. I walked straight toward them. My heart pounded a steady rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained a completely impassive mask. I needed to know exactly where they stood. I needed to know if the parents who constantly demanded my financial help over the past decade would finally draw a line when it came to Melody blatantly stealing from me. "Mom, Dad, I need to speak with you," I said, cutting through their conversation with a duke. They turned to me, and the pleasant smiles vanished from their faces instantly. "Audrey," my mother hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me behind a pillar away from their high society audience. "What on earth are you doing down here looking like that? You are supposed to be staying out of sight until the official family portraits." "Melody just broke into my room," I said, keeping my voice low but incredibly firm. "She threw a return economy ticket at me and explicitly told me I am banned from attending the wedding ceremony. Then she physically ripped grandmother's diamond pendant off my neck and stole it, claiming a princess deserves it more." I waited for the shock to register on their faces. I waited for the parental outrage. I waited for my father to set his expensive drink down and march upstairs to demand the stolen necklace back from his youngest daughter. Instead, my parents exchanged a look that chilled me to my bones. My mother smoothed her gown and let out a sigh of annoyance. "Oh, Audrey," she said, "must you always be so dramatic? It is just a necklace. Melody is under stress right now. She is about to become royalty tomorrow. You need to be more understanding." I stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of her response. "Understanding," I repeated. "She assaulted me and stole our family heirloom. She kicked me out of her wedding." Gregory took a sip of his scotch and glared at me. "Your sister is entering the highest echelon," he said. "She has an image to maintain. We cannot have you hovering around. Frankly, Audrey, your presence here is a liability. You have always been jealous of your sister." "Jealous?" I asked. my voice steadying into a calm. I paid off your business loans, Dad. I funded the renovation on your house, Mom. I work 80-hour weeks while Melody shops on my dime. There is nothing about her life that makes me jealous. That is the problem, my mother snapped, pointing a finger at me. You are so obsessed with money and work that you have forgotten how to be a supportive sister. You are bitter because no man wants a woman who acts like a human calculator. Melody found a royal prince, and instead of being happy for her, you are trying to ruin her wedding with complaints about a necklace. Go back to your room, pack your bags, and use the ticket she gave you to go home. My father nodded. Go back to your sad little spreadsheets, Audrey. You do not belong here. You never have. We are moving up in the world, and we will not let your bitterness drag us down. Leave this hotel quietly, or I will make sure you regret it. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world. They were strangers to me now. No, they were worse than strangers. They were parasites who had found a bigger host to feed on. I am not leaving without my property, I stated. I will go to the local authorities and report the theft if I have to. My father's face flushed red with fury. The facade of the wealthy aristocrat vanished, replaced by the ruthless grifter I saw. You will do no such thing, he snarled. He turned and signaled to a pair of hotel security guards standing near the entrance. They rushed over, recognizing my father as the father of the bride. Is there a problem, sir? One of the guards asked. Yes, my father lied without missing a beat. This woman is harassing my family. She is not on our guest list, and she is causing a disturbance in the lobby. Please escort her off the property. I looked at my mother, expecting maternal instinct to kick in. She turned her back to me and took a sip of her champagne. Mom, you need to come with us, the security guard said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. I brushed his hand off, straightening my jacket. Do not touch me, I said. I will go upstairs and get my own luggage. They escorted me up to the 4th floor, treating me like a criminal while I packed my bags. Within 15 minutes, I was marching through the lobby, pulling my suitcase, while flanked by 2 security guards. My parents did not look my way as I was guided out the front doors. The doors clicked shut behind me. I stood alone on the cobblestone streets of Cordovia. The evening air was unfamiliar. Luxury cars drove past, carrying wealthy guests to galas. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, isolated by my own blood in a foreign country. I had no hotel, no family, and no plan. But as I stood under the glow of the streetlights, the initial shock faded. A cold, calculating energy took its place inside my chest. They abandoned me entirely, but forgot one very crucial detail. I am a forensic accountant. I pulled my thick wool coat tighter around my shaking shoulders to block out the freezing evening chill. The grand entrance of the luxury hotel loomed behind me, but I did not dare to look back. I pulled out my phone to execute a basic survival plan. Find a new hotel room, book a flight out of Cordovia, and figure out my next move. I opened a travel booking application and found a modest business hotel located a few miles away from the Royal District. I selected a standard room and entered my primary credit card information. A red error message flashed across the screen. Transaction declined. Please contact your bank. I frowned. That card had a massive credit limit and a zero balance. I assumed it was an international fraud alert triggered by my sudden location change. I switched to my secondary card, a premium travel card that I used exclusively for overseas expenses. I entered the security code and hit process. The loading wheel spun for a few seconds before another red banner appeared. Declined. A very cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I stood under a street lamp and opened my digital wallet, selecting a third card. Denied. A fourth card. Denied. The cool logic that usually governed my mind began to slip, giving way to a creeping sense of dread. I opened my banking application, expecting to see a simple security hold that I could clear with a quick verification code. Instead, the screen loaded to display a series of numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. My available credit across all accounts was 0. Every single line of credit I had meticulously built over the past decade was completely maxed out. My checking account, which usually held a comfortable safety net, was overdrawn. I urgently refreshed the banking application, thinking it had to be a temporary glitch, a massive server error, or a visual bug. The numbers remained unchanged. My financial identity, the armor I had spent my entire adult life constructing, had been completely obliterated. Before I could dial the international customer service number for my bank, my phone vibrated in my palm. The caller identification displayed a secure encrypted connection. It was Jada. Jada was my sister-in-law married to my older brother Derek. She was a brilliant corporate lawyer, a fierce advocate, and a woman who suffered absolutely no fools. As an African-American woman who had fought her way to the top of a ruthless New York law firm, Jada possessed a razor-sharp intellect that I deeply respected. She was the only person in our family who saw my parents and Melody for exactly what they were. We had formed a quiet but unbreakable alliance over the years. I answered the call immediately. Jada. I said, my voice tight with tension. My cards are entirely frozen. Something is terribly wrong with my bank accounts. Audrey. Listen to me very carefully, Jada said. Her voice lacked its usual warm greeting. She sounded all business, rapid and precise. Are you somewhere safe? I looked around the cobblestone street. I am standing outside the hotel. My parents just had security throw me out. Melody kicked me out of the wedding and stole grandmother's diamond. I can deal with that later, but right now I have zero access to my funds. I know, Jada replied, her tone grim. That is why I am calling you on an encrypted line. I am sitting in my home office surrounded by a mountain of mail that was forwarded from the family estate in Connecticut. Derek is asleep, but I started opening these letters because the return addresses looked suspicious. Audrey, your credit score has completely tanked. It dropped over 300 points in the last 48 hours. My mind raced trying to process the impossibility of her statement. That makes no sense, Jada. I have zero debt. I pay every statement in full. I have not opened a new account in years. You did not open these accounts, Jada stated flatly. Someone else did. I stood frozen on the sidewalk as luxurious carriages and black town cars rolled past me carrying guests to royal pre-wedding events. What exactly are you looking at, Jada? I asked. I am looking at default notices. Jada explained, the paper rustling over the line. I am looking at massive withdrawal confirmations and warnings from 3 different financial institutions. The mail was routed to your old childhood address at your parents' house. They must have thought you would never see it. But since your father made Derek a secondary contact on the estate management account, a batch of misdirected mail ended up in our mailbox today. I started digging into public financial registries using my firm credentials. Audrey, your identity has been thoroughly compromised. Who would have the information necessary to bypass my security questions, I asked, though the terrifying answer was already forming in my mind. You know exactly who, Jada said softly. Your parents have your social security number, your birth certificate, and all your foundational documents from when you lived at home. They know your maternal grandmother's maiden name. They know your first pet's name. They know every security question answer required to verify your identity. The cold night air suddenly felt suffocating. You are telling me my own parents stole my identity to drain my accounts? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. It is worse than just draining your checking account, Audrey, Jada warned. They did not just take your cash. They weaponized your pristine financial background to secure something massive. My legal software is showing a major property lien registered under your name. I need you to stay completely calm and find a secure Wi-Fi connection immediately. I am wiring emergency funds to a secure digital wallet that cannot be traced to your compromised accounts. You absolutely need to get off the cold street right now before they act again. I did exactly as Jada instructed. I walked briskly away from the Grand Cordovian Hotel, putting physical distance between myself and my parents. Down a narrow cobblestone alley, I found a dimly lit 24-hour internet cafe. I bought a black coffee using the emergency digital wallet Jada had just provisioned. The transaction cleared. I took a seat in the corner facing the door and pulled out my laptop. I connected to the secure network and launched an encrypted video call. Jada appeared on my screen immediately. Her office was illuminated only by the glow of her dual monitors highlighting the fierce concentration on her face. She shared her screen pulling up a scanned PDF of a highly sensitive legal document. "Audrey, look at this," Jada said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Do you remember the commercial plaza in downtown Boston? The one your grandfather left to you and your parents as joint tenants?" I nodded, scanning the dense legal text. I legally owned a 33% stake, but I had allowed my parents to manage the property and collect the rental income. I never touched a dime of it. "They leveraged it," Jada stated flatly. "They leveraged the entire property, but they needed your signature to do it." Jada zoomed in on the final page of the document. There, sitting clearly on the borrower's signature line, was my name. It was a masterful forgery, matching the precise slant of my handwriting. Next to it was a digital notary stamp verified and sealed 3 weeks ago. "They took out a second mortgage," Jada continued. "Audrey, they took out $2 million against the Boston property." The number hit me like a physical blow. $2 million. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the numbers with my eyes, hoping I had misread the zeros. I had not. It was a massive fraudulent debt anchored entirely to my name. How did the bank approve this? I demanded, my forensic accounting instincts kicking in over the shock. A loan of that magnitude requires extensive income verification and deep credit checks. My parents defaulted on their business loans 5 years ago. "That is exactly why they needed you," Jada explained, pulling up the underwriting summary. "The bank did not approve the loan based on your parents' financial standing. They approved it based on yours. You have a completely immaculate credit history, Audrey. You have zero debt, a massive savings account, and a high 6-figure salary at a top-tier Manhattan auditing firm. You are the perfect phantom borrower." I stared at the screen, sickened by the precision of their betrayal. My parents had weaponized my responsibility against me. I spent my 20s living frugally, paying off student loans, and building an impenetrable financial foundation so I would never end up in debt like them. They watched me build that armor, and then they stole it to fund their delusions of grandeur. "They intercepted your tax documents," Jada said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic register. "They used your social security number and provided fraudulent employment verification letters. Because your financial profile was essentially bulletproof, the bank rushed the approval process. The $2 million cleared and was disbursed exactly 14 days ago. 14 days ago. I calculated the timeline in my head. That was precisely when Melody started posting pictures of her lavish pre-wedding shopping sprees in Paris and Milan. It was when my parents suddenly upgraded their commercial flights to private jets. Where did the money go? I asked, my voice growing dangerously quiet. Jada switched tabs on her monitor, bringing up a wire transfer receipt. They did not keep it in an American account. As soon as the bank disbursed the $2 million, your father initiated an international wire transfer. He moved the entire sum to a holding account in Cordovia. The sheer scale of their malice washed over me. This was not a simple case of toxic favoritism. This was a calculated, coordinated financial assassination. "They knew what would happen," I whispered, staring at the screen. "They knew that a $2 million mortgage attached to my name would eventually trigger alerts. They knew that once the first massive monthly payment was missed, the bank would come after me. My assets would be seized. My credit would be ruined. My career at the auditing firm, where financial integrity is a strict condition of employment, would be terminated immediately." "They sacrificed you," Jada said softly, her dark eyes blazing with righteous fury. "They literally sold your entire future to buy Melody a royal wedding. They threw you out of the hotel because they needed you out of the way before the first default notice hit your accounts." I closed my eyes. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. My parents did not just want me away from the royal family because I was an embarrassment to their new aristocratic aesthetic. They needed me isolated, broke, and stranded in a foreign country so I could not fight back when the financial bomb detonated. They thought I would be a helpless victim crushed under the weight of a $2 million debt I could never repay. They thought they had destroyed me. I opened my eyes and looked at Jada. The panic that had gripped me outside the hotel was completely gone. In its place was a crystalline, absolute focus. As a forensic accountant, I spent my days hunting down corporate embezzlers, tracing hidden offshore accounts, and dismantling complex financial crimes. My parents had just committed a massive federal offense and left a digital paper trail leading right back to themselves. Jada, I said, my voice steady and cold, I need you to act as my proxy on United States soil. I need you to start compiling every single document related to this mortgage. I want the IP addresses used to submit the digital signatures. I want the routing numbers for the offshore transfer. I want everything. Jada smiled, a fierce, predatory expression. I am already on it, Audrey. Derek does not know anything yet, and I plan to keep it that way. What are you going to do from Cordovia? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I am going to do my job, I replied. They used my name to move $2 million of fraudulent money into a European principality. I am going to find out exactly where that money is sitting, and then I am going to burn their fairy tale to the ground. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen as Jada brought up new documents. We needed to understand the motive. $2 million was an enormous sum, but in international high society, it was merely a drop in the ocean. Why risk federal prison for this? Jada typed rapidly. I have been pulling public records regarding the Cordovian royal family, she explained. King Edward is famously obsessed with financial transparency. Cordovia is a banking hub maintaining power by projecting absolute economic stability. When Prince Harrison announced his engagement to an American, the press dug into your parents' background. I nodded, rubbing my temples. My parents filed for bankruptcy 5 years ago. They had a history of failed business ventures. The Cordovian vetting process would flag them immediately as opportunists rather than legitimate aristocrats. Exactly, Jada said, highlighting a paragraph. To marry into this royal family, the bride must bring something to the table. Today they call it an independent bridal trust. Protocol dictates the bride's family must establish a trust to prove she is not marrying the prince for his money. It is a demonstration of generational wealth. I stared at the screen as the horrifying reality set in. They needed a bridal trust to prove Melody was an old money American heiress, I said. They needed to show King Edward that Melody came from a family of substantial independent wealth. Jada pulled up a leaked article from a Cordovian Society magazine. The headline praised Brenda and Gregory for their generous contribution to the royal estate. The article claimed that Melody was the beneficiary of a historic family trust, fundamentally securing her status as a wealthy socialite. They did not have $2 million? I stated, my voice eerily calm. They did not have $200,000, so they stole my financial identity to create a fake dowry. They hijacked your entire life, Audrey, Jada said softly. They took your pristine credit score, your 80-hour work weeks, and your immaculate financial standing. They packaged your stability into a neat little box and used it to buy Melody a crown. I leaned back in the plastic chair. The sheer scale of their delusion was staggering. My parents spent their lives pretending to be wealthier than they were. They drove leased luxury cars they could not afford. But this was a different level of fraud. They were defrauding a sovereign nation. They were lying to a monarch. Look at the structure of this trust, Jada said, bringing up a routing document. They routed the stolen mortgage funds through a holding company in the Cayman Islands before landing it in a Cordovian private bank. They set it up to look like a mature generational wealth fund, maturing just in time for the wedding. I examined the routing numbers. The meticulous nature of the fraud was disgusting. Gregory had always fancied himself a brilliant businessman, but he was nothing more than a cheap con artist. He had orchestrated a complex financial crime just to validate his favorite daughter's narcissistic fantasies. They sold me, I whispered. It was a literal transaction. My parents evaluated my worth, calculated my credit limit, and traded my future for Melody's royal title. They knew I would face criminal investigations for defaulting on a massive mortgage. They knew I would lose my professional licenses. They knew I would be ruined. And they did it anyway. Jada let out a heavy sigh. I have reviewed the legal implications, Audrey. The moment the first mortgage payment bounces, the bank will initiate foreclosure on the Boston property. Because your signature is on the loan, they will aggressively pursue your personal assets. They will freeze your checking accounts, garnish your wages, and the auditing firm will fire you the second they see a defaulted loan. I know, I said. My mind was mapping out the blast radius. But they made one fatal mistake, Jada. They assumed I would play the role of the obedient victim. They assumed I would be too embarrassed to fight back. They thought I would quietly absorb the ruin just like I always absorbed their insults. Jada's eyes flashed with fierce approval. What is our next move? I need you to dig deeper into that offshore holding company, I instructed. Gregory is not smart enough to build a clean shell company from scratch. He bought an off-the-shelf corporate entity to route the money. I need to know exactly which entity he used and who else is using it. I need ammunition that hits harder than identity theft. I will run a full diagnostic on the Cayman routing numbers, Jada promised. I will find out exactly where that money touched before it landed in Cordovia. Do it, I said. And Jada, keep Derek out of this. He has always been a coward when it comes to his parents. If he finds out what we are doing, he will warn them instantly and ruin our entire strategy. Jada scoffed, her expression hardening. My husband has been turning a blind eye to your parents' toxicity for years. I am done covering for his weakness. You have my word, Audrey. This stays between us. I ended the call and closed my laptop. The internet cafe was completely empty. Outside, the cobblestone streets were quiet. The distant glow of the royal palace illuminated the night sky. Inside, my sister was likely sleeping in silk sheets, dreaming of her wedding. My parents were likely toasting to their grift, believing they had secured their place in high society. They thought they had buried me. They thought throwing me out onto the street was the end of the story. They drastically underestimated the wrath of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I gathered my coat and stepped back out into the freezing Cordovian night. The time for crying was over. I was going to permanently rip the fake crown right off my sister's incredibly greedy head. I walked down the quiet cobblestone street, pulling my suitcase behind me. The freezing night air bit at my cheeks, but the cold kept my mind remarkably sharp. I needed a secure base of operations immediately. My phone buzzed in my pocket, signaling an incoming notification. It was a secure alert from the digital wallet application Jada had instructed me to download. A transfer of $10,000 had just cleared. It came directly from the private personal account, completely separate from any joint finances she held with my brother Derek. She had acted with lightning speed, providing me the ammunition I needed to survive the night. I checked the map on my phone, scanning the outskirts of the city. I bypassed every luxury resort and boutique inn, searching for something completely off the radar. 3 miles away from the glittering royal district, I found it. A small, independent motel tucked behind a commercial transit depot. It was exactly what I needed. An anonymous concrete building that catered to cargo drivers and budget travelers. No valet, no concierge, and absolutely no connection to the high society circles my parents were currently infiltrating. I hailed a passing city cab and paid the driver in cash using the ATM withdrawal I had just made with the emergency funds. We drove away from the palace lights, plunging into the utilitarian sector of Cordovia. The cab dropped me off in front of a flickering neon sign. I walked into the cramped lobby and paid for a room using a prepaid card I set up through the digital wallet. The desk clerk did not ask for a passport or ask any questions. He simply handed me a heavy metal key and pointed me toward the stairs. The room was aggressively bare. A narrow bed, a laminate desk, and a small bathroom with flickering fluorescent lights. It was a staggering downgrade from the lavish suite my parents had just ordered security to throw me out of. But as I locked the deadbolt and threw the security chain across the door, I felt an immense wave of relief. This room was a fortress. It was a blind spot in their peripheral vision. They thought I was wandering the streets crying over my ruined credit. They had no idea I was digging the trenches for a financial war. I dropped my suitcase onto the faded carpet and immediately walked over to the small coffee machine resting on the laminate desk. I tore open a packet of cheap, dark roast grounds, poured water into the reservoir, and hit the power button. The machine sputtered to life, filling the small room with the bitter, harsh smell of cheap caffeine. I took off my heavy wool coat, draped it over the edge of the bed, and rolled my shoulders to release the tension. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and set it squarely in the center of the desk. The machine booted up with a soft hum. I poured the black coffee into a paper cup and took a long, scalding sip. The heat seared my throat, grounding me entirely in the present moment. I sat in the stiff wooden chair and cracked my knuckles. The time for being the obedient betrayed sister was officially over. I was a senior forensic accountant. I tracked millions of dollars in corporate fraud for a living. I unraveled complex embezzlement schemes crafted by brilliant criminal minds. Gregory and Brenda were amateur grifters playing a very dangerous game with sovereign wealth. I engaged my virtual private network, masking my location and heavily encrypting my connection. I launched the proprietary forensic auditing software my firm used for high-level investigations. The screen transitioned to a stark black interface filled with cascading lines of code and data query prompts. I felt a familiar thrill wash over me. The raw emotional pain of my parents' betrayal began to recede, packing itself away into a tight, compartmentalized box. In its place, a cold, predatory focus emerged. I was no longer the tragic victim of a family drama. I was the apex predator entering my natural hunting ground. I opened a secure communication channel with Jada. The chat window blinked, confirming our end-to-end encryption. I sent a single message requesting the specific routing numbers and shell company names she had extracted from the forged mortgage documents. Jada replied instantly, uploading a compressed data file containing the digital footprint of the $2 million transfer. I imported the file directly into my tracing software. The program immediately began querying global financial databases, matching the routing numbers against known banking registries. I watched the screen as the stolen funds began to map themselves out visually. The $2 million had originated from the Boston bank where my parents forged my signature. From there, it bounced to a clearinghouse in Delaware. That was standard procedure. But the next jump was where the fraud became blatant. The money hit a corporate entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Holdings International. I highlighted the entity name and ran a deep background check using European financial registries. Gregory had purchased this shell company explicitly for the wedding deception. He needed an offshore vehicle to wash the money, making it appear as though the funds had been maturing in a generational trust rather than freshly borrowed against stolen property. The audacity of his plan was almost laughable. He actually believed that routing stolen mortgage funds through a generic island shell company would be enough to fool the Cordovian Royal Treasury. I took another sip of black coffee, mapping the final leg of the journey. The money moved from the Cayman Islands directly into the elite private banking sector of Cordovia, resting in an escrow account designated for Melody and her royal bridal trust. It was a neat little package waiting to be presented to King Edward as proof of her aristocratic pedigree. But they left massive digital fingerprints everywhere. The digital fingerprints were glowing on my screen, a perfect trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to a federal indictment. I was just about to run a cross-reference on the Cayman Islands holding company when my cell phone vibrated violently against the laminate desk. I ignored it. I was in the zone, tracing the fraudulent money transfer my parents orchestrated to buy Melody her royal title. The phone vibrated again. Then a continuous, relentless buzzing rattled the cheap plastic casing against the wood. I dragged my eyes away from the financial software and picked up the device. The screen was flooded with notifications. Dozens of text messages were pouring in from numbers I had not spoken to in months. Extended family members, former college classmates, and casual acquaintances from New York were desperately trying to reach me. I unlocked the screen and opened the most recent message. It was from a cousin who usually only contacted me once a year. His message contained a link to a notorious celebrity gossip website in the United States, followed by a text asking if I was okay and if I needed him to wire me money for a rehabilitation center. I frowned, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. Rehabilitation center. I tapped the link. The browser loaded the web page, revealing a massive glaring headline splashed across the top of the gossip column, which newly minted American royal had to forcibly banish her older sister from the kingdom on the eve of her fairy tale wedding. I felt my pulse steady into a slow, cold rhythm as I read the article. The blind item was ruthlessly detailed. It claimed that the bride's older sister, a previously successful but deeply troubled accountant, had suffered a massive psychological break. According to unnamed sources close to the family, the sister was a deranged, unstable addict who had arrived in Cordovia heavily intoxicated and caused a severe security threat at the luxury hotel. The article went on to state that the loving and heartbroken parents were forced to intervene to protect the royal family from a dangerous public scandal. They had heroically escorted the erratic sibling out of the venue, out of the country, and were currently seeking emergency psychiatric care for her back in the United States. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I scrolled down reading the fabricated details of my supposed meltdown. They claimed I had attacked hotel staff. They claimed I was found wandering the hallways screaming obscenities out of pure jealousy because my younger sister was marrying a prince. I set the phone down on the desk. This was not a random leak. This was a highly coordinated, preemptive strike. Melody and my parents had hired a ruthless public relations crisis team to control the narrative of my sudden absence from the royal wedding. They knew that people would ask questions when the bride's only sister failed to appear in the official photographs. Instead of telling the truth, which was that Melody thought my middle-class aesthetic was an embarrassment, they decided to utterly annihilate my character. By painting me as a dangerous, unstable addict, they accomplished two things simultaneously. First, they provided a perfectly sympathetic excuse for my absence, making Melody look like a tragic victim burdened by a broken family member. Second, they completely discredited me. If I tried to speak out about the stolen $2 million mortgage or the stolen diamond necklace, no one would believe me. The media would simply write off my accusations as the paranoid delusions of a jealous, deranged addict. My phone chimed again. This time it was an email alert. Then another text. I watched the notifications pile up. A message from my aunt asking if I was safe. A direct message on social media from a high school friend offering to pray for my recovery. The social sabotage was absolute and devastating. My parents were systematically burning my entire reputation to the ground to ensure their fraudulent house of cards remained standing. They were isolating me socially, just as they had isolated me financially. I picked up my phone and opened the secure chat window with Jada. Before I could type a word, a message from her popped up on the encrypted screen. Jada wrote telling me she had just seen the tabloid articles hitting the American news cycles. She warned me that the story was gaining massive traction online because the public was currently obsessed with the Cordovian royal wedding. Any drama associated with the bride was instant viral gold. I typed a response to Jada telling her I was reading the exact same garbage. I asked her if Derek had seen it. Jada replied that my brother was currently pacing their living room fielding calls from horrified relatives who wanted to know if I was truly locked away in a psychiatric ward. Jada told me she was letting Derek handle the panic while she continued securing the offshore financial documents. She asked me how I was holding up under the character assassination. I looked away from the phone and stared at my reflection in the dark window of the cheap motel room. A normal person would have posted a frantic, tearful video online trying to defend themselves against the vicious lies. A normal person would have called their parents begging them to tell the truth. But I was done acting like a normal person dealing with a normal family. I typed a single sentence back to Jada telling her I was perfectly fine. I closed the chat application and placed my phone face down on the laminate desk, shutting out the digital noise of the smear campaign. The tabloids could call me a deranged addict all they wanted. My extended family could whisper about my tragic downfall. Public opinion was a fragile, fleeting thing, but forensic accounting data was permanent. My parents thought they could silence me by destroying my social standing. They failed to realize that by severing every emotional and social tie I had left to the family, they had just removed my final restraints. There was no guilt left. There was no hesitation. The public relations smear campaign was the last nail in the coffin of my loyalty. I turned my attention back to the glowing lines of code on my laptop screen. The offshore shell company routing the stolen $2 million was still waiting to be unraveled. I highlighted the next block of financial data, cracking my knuckles as I prepared to dig deeper into the transaction history. Let them spin their fairy tale to the press. Let Melody play the heartbroken bride. I was going to let them build their lie as high as possible before I kicked out the foundational pillars. The digital trail was undeniable, and I was going to follow it straight into the heart of their royal deception. I had just initiated a trace on the offshore shell company when my laptop screen flashed with an incoming secure call. It was not Jada. The caller identification displayed the private office number of my managing partner at the Manhattan auditing firm. His name was Mr. Campbell. I stared at the flashing incoming call notification for a few seconds. My firm was notoriously strict about public image. We handled high-level forensic accounting for federal agencies and international central banks. I knew exactly what this call was about. The tabloid poison had crossed the Atlantic and seeped into my professional life. I adjusted my posture, took a deep breath, and clicked the answer button. Audrey, my managing partner said. His voice was completely devoid of its usual warm professionalism. It sounded strained and deeply uncomfortable. I am sorry to call you on an encrypted channel so late at night, but we have a critical situation. Good evening, Mr. Campbell, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. I assume this is regarding the media circus surrounding my sister's wedding. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Yes, Audrey, it is. The partners and I have been flooded with alerts from our risk management department over the past 2 hours. The articles circulating online are highly damaging. They are claiming you had a severe psychological episode and that you are struggling with serious addiction issues resulting in your forced removal from Cordovia by royal security. Those articles are entirely fabricated, I stated firmly. My parents and my sister orchestrated a preemptive public relations smear campaign to cover up the fact that they uninvited me to the wedding. I can undergo any drug testing or psychological evaluation the firm requires immediately upon my return to New York. I believe you, Audrey, Mr. Campbell said, and he actually sounded sincere. You have been one of our most brilliant and reliable forensic accountants for years. Your track record is spotless. But belief is not the issue here. The issue is liability and security clearance. I stayed silent, waiting for the inevitable blow. I knew how corporate risk management worked. Truth was secondary to optics when billion-dollar government contracts were on the line. Our firm audits the Central Bank of Cordovia. Mr. Campbell continued. We also hold sensitive contracts with the United States Department of the Treasury. The individuals handling those accounts must have bulletproof public profiles. Right now, your name is trending globally as an unstable security threat. The optics are catastrophic. We cannot risk our government clients pulling their contracts because one of our senior accountants is embroiled in a massive international tabloid scandal. I understand, I said. The cold logic of the corporate machine was familiar to me. What is the board deciding? Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full internal investigation, Mr. Campbell announced. It is an administrative suspension without pay. Your corporate access credentials, your email, and your database logins will be restricted within the hour. We need to let the media storm die down and conduct a thorough background check before we can even discuss reinstating you. I am incredibly sorry, Audrey. I know how hard you have worked for your position. Do what you have to do. Mr. Campbell, I replied. I will handle my family situation and clear my name. He wished me luck and disconnected the call. The screen went black. A moment later, a notification popped up on the corner of my monitor indicating that my remote connection to the firm's primary servers had been terminated. I leaned back in the stiff wooden chair of my cheap motel room, letting the silence wash over me. The execution of their plan was brutally effective. My parents and Melody had systematically targeted every single pillar of my existence. They had taken a sledgehammer to my entire reality to build a fake throne for my sister. They wanted to ensure I was so thoroughly crushed, so completely isolated and powerless, that I could never pose a threat to their aristocratic illusion. 24 hours ago, I had a pristine credit score, a massive savings account, a respected career, and a family I thought I was supposed to protect. Now I had absolutely nothing. My family ties were permanently severed. My financial identity was stolen and leveraged for a $2 million fraudulent loan. My personal reputation was annihilated on a global scale. My career, the one thing I had built entirely on my own merit, was suspended indefinitely. But as I stared at the disconnected server notification on my screen, I did not feel panic. I did not feel the crushing weight of despair that my family was counting on. Instead, I felt a profound, icy sense of liberation. They made one catastrophic miscalculation. By stripping away my career, my finances, and my social standing, they removed every single thing I had left to protect. They took away my fear of losing my job. They took away my fear of public embarrassment. They took away the heavy burden of being the responsible older sister who always compromised to keep the peace. I was no longer a corporate employee bound by strict professional codes of conduct. I was a highly trained financial investigator with a severed connection to the corporate world and a massive score to settle. Furthermore, they underestimated my foresight. The moment I saw the tabloid articles online, I knew my firm would be forced to suspend my access. Corporate risk management is entirely predictable. Anticipating Mr. Campbell's call, I had spent the last hour downloading the entire encrypted data packet containing the offshore routing numbers, the escrow account details, and the Central Bank of Cordovia ledgers directly onto a secure offline hard drive. When the firm severed my connection, it simply did not matter. The door was locked, but I was already inside. I held the digital smoking gun in my physical possession. I unplugged the hard drive and held it in my palm, feeling the weight of the data. My parents thought they had buried me alive. They thought I would cower in the shadows, too ashamed of the addict label to show my face in public. They thought I would quietly absorb the financial ruin and let them walk away with stolen millions and a royal title. They were wrong. I placed the hard drive back on the desk and opened a new blank document. It was time to start drafting the final execution order. The blank document on my screen was a canvas for absolute destruction. My firm had locked me out of the primary servers, but corporate IT departments always lacked imagination. When you conduct high-level forensic audits on foreign central banks, you never rely on a single point of entry. Months ago, during a routine stress test of our international auditing software, I had established a secure ghost node. It was a completely invisible backdoor clearance designed to maintain continuous monitoring of offshore ledgers in the event of a catastrophic system failure. Mr. Campbell thought he had revoked my access, but he only closed the front door. I was already sitting in the basement. I typed a sequence of override commands into my terminal. The screen flashed blue, confirming my ghost node was active and completely undetected by the firm's network administrators. I had unrestricted, unfettered access to the deepest financial archives of the Central Bank of Cordovia. And better yet, I had unlimited time. My suspension meant no morning briefings, no client consultations, and no billable hours to log. My parents intended to strip away my livelihood to render me helpless. Instead, they handed me the greatest weapon an investigator could ask for: uninterrupted total focus. I began by setting up a chronological timeline of the $2 million fraud. I needed this dossier to be so airtight, so mathematically absolute, that neither a royal decree nor a slick public relations team could ever dismantle it. I opened the file Jada had sent me containing the original fraudulent mortgage agreement. The digital signature on the document was a perfect visual replica of my own. But visual perfection means nothing in digital forensics. I extracted the metadata embedded in the signature file. Every digital action leaves a footprint. I ran the metadata through a geolocation decryption tool. Within seconds, the software returned a highly specific Internet Protocol address. I cross-referenced that IP address with public utility records. It matched the exact broadband router installed at my parents' sprawling estate back in the United States. The digital signature was stamped at 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I pulled up my own work logs from that exact date and time. I was sitting in a boardroom in Manhattan, presenting a quarterly risk assessment to a group of banking executives. There were 12 witnesses and a signed security log proving I was hundreds of miles away when my signature was allegedly applied to that mortgage. The foundation of their fraud was already crumbling. Next, I moved to the money. I needed to trace the exact route the stolen funds took from the Boston Bank to the Royal Escrow account. I mapped the first wire transfer. Gregory had moved the $2 million from the fraudulent loan account into a temporary holding account in Delaware. From there, the money was wired internationally to Apex Holdings International, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. I deployed a tracing algorithm to penetrate the corporate veil of Apex Holdings. My parents were arrogant, but they were severely technologically illiterate. They assumed offshore banking meant absolute secrecy. They failed to realize that global anti-money laundering regulations require every transaction to generate a unique tracking node. I followed the digital nodes. The data showed that Apex Holdings was not an isolated entity. It was part of a sprawling network of ghost companies that had been flagged multiple times by international financial watchdogs. My father had not just laundered the stolen money. He had routed it through a known criminal syndicate to wash it clean before sending it to the Cordovian Royal Treasury. I breached the Central Bank of Cordovia ledger using my ghost node clearance. The royal family prided themselves on transparency, requiring all incoming dowry trusts to be held in a heavily monitored escrow account until the marriage was officially consummated. I queried the database for Melody's bridal trust. The ledger materialized on my screen. There it was, $2 million sitting in an aristocratic holding fund waiting to validate my sister's fake pedigree. I cross-referenced the incoming wire transfer to the royal escrow with the outgoing wire transfer from Apex Holdings. The timestamps matched perfectly. The transaction amounts down to the exact decimal point matched perfectly. The routing nodes linked together like a steel chain. I had successfully mapped the entire life cycle of the stolen money from the moment my parents forged my signature in their living room to the moment it landed in the King of Cordovia's prestigious banking system. The sheer gravity of their crime was laid bare in front of me. They had contaminated a royal treasury with illicit funds. King Edward was a monarch obsessed with economic integrity. He had spent his entire reign fortifying Cordovia as a spotless financial haven. When he discovered that his future daughter-in-law had injected stolen laundered money into his pristine banking ecosystem, his wrath would be biblical. I opened my encrypted communication channel with Jada to brief her on the progress. She was working late into the night on the American side, compiling the hard copies of the bank fraud reports. I sent her a secure summary of the routing nodes. Jada replied immediately, stating she had successfully drafted a comprehensive federal complaint outlining the identity theft and wire fraud. She had it ready to file with the federal authorities the exact second I gave the signal. We were operating with lethal synchronization. My sister-in-law understood the assignment perfectly. We were not just exposing a lie, we were orchestrating a total systemic dismantling of my parents' entire reality. I spent the next several hours compiling the evidence into a master dossier. I attached the IP logs, the signature metadata, the Delaware transfer receipts, and the Cayman Island routing nodes. I cross-referenced every single data point with international banking regulations, citing the exact anti-money laundering statutes my parents had violated. I structured the document not as a personal grievance, but as an executive-level forensic audit report. It was cold, objective, and devastatingly precise. I sat back and looked at the completed file. The sun was beginning to rise outside the window of my cheap motel room, casting a pale gray light over the laminate desk. In a few hours, Melody would be putting on her designer wedding gown. My parents would be preparing to rub shoulders with European aristocrats. They would be smiling for the cameras, believing their vicious public relations smear campaign had successfully neutralized me. They believed I was a broken, disgraced addict hiding in the shadows. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding a digital guillotine directly over their heads. The trap was set. The evidence was irrefutable. I saved the master dossier to a secure encrypted cloud server and closed my laptop. It was time to get dressed. I had a royal wedding to attend. I had just stood up to grab my tailored navy suit from the narrow motel closet when a sharp metallic chime erupted from my laptop speakers. I froze. That specific audio alert was reserved for Level 1 threat matches in my forensic auditing software. I turned back to the laminate desk, where my screen was now flashing with a bright crimson warning banner. The automated deep scan I had left running in the background on Apex Holdings International had finally breached the final layer of corporate obfuscation. I sat back down in the stiff wooden chair and clicked open the alert. Gregory had always been a man who loved a bargain. He spent his entire life looking for shortcuts and cheap ways to project extreme wealth. When he needed an offshore shell company to wash my stolen $2 million, he clearly did not hire a premium international financial lawyer. He bought an off-the-shelf corporate entity from a shady online broker to save a few $1,000s. That relentless cheapness was about to be his total undoing. The software had finished cross-referencing the corporate registration numbers of Apex Holdings against global law enforcement databases. The results cascading down my screen were breathtaking. Apex Holdings International was not just a generic tax haven used by wealthy businessmen to avoid capital gains. It was a primary laundering hub for a massive international criminal syndicate. My eyes scanned the scrolling text pulling data directly from shared international policing servers. The entity was currently under active joint investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States and Interpol in Europe. According to the decrypted case files, Apex Holdings had been flagged for washing hundreds of millions of dollars tied to narcotics trafficking and illegal arms dealing across the European continent. It was a radioactive entity. Financial institutions across the globe had it placed on a strict black list. Gregory, in his infinite arrogance and staggering financial ignorance, had taken $2 million of stolen American mortgage funds and shoved it directly through a known criminal artery. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was utilizing a banking channel actively monitored by federal agents. He thought he was playing the role of a sophisticated international aristocrat, but he had essentially walked into a bank vault covered in glowing neon paint. I immediately reopened my secure communication channel with Jada. The sun was rising in Cordovia, but it was the middle of the night in New York. I knew she would still be awake preparing our legal counterstrike. I sent her an urgent priority ping. She answered the encrypted video call within seconds, looking sharp and entirely focused despite the late hour. Jada, I said, leaning close to the screen. You need to pull up the federal court dockets right now. Run a search for Apex Holdings International. I watched her face as she rapidly typed the query into her legal database. A moment later, her jaw dropped. Audrey. She breathed, leaning back in her leather office chair. This is a massive federal racketeering case. The FBI has been building a profile on this specific shell company for the last 18 months. They have active wiretaps and financial tracking nodes monitoring every single cent that moves in and out of their Cayman accounts. They monitored the transfer. I confirmed, my voice cold and steady. When Gregory wired the $2 million from the Delaware clearinghouse into Apex Holdings, he tripped a massive federal wire alarm. And when he moved that money from Apex Holdings directly into the Cordovian Royal Escrow account, he did something infinitely worse. Jada nodded slowly, realizing the full catastrophic scale of my parents' blunder. He connected an active international criminal syndicate directly to the Cordovian crown. Exactly, I said. King Edward has spent 30 years building Cordovia into a pristine, flawless banking sanctuary. His entire sovereign wealth relies on a reputation of absolute financial integrity. He refuses to do business with anyone carrying even a hint of illicit activity. Now his future daughter-in-law has just injected $2 million of active cartel-linked dirty money straight into his royal treasury. The political and economic implications were staggering. If the international press discovered that the Cordovian royal family was accepting funds from an Interpol-flagged shell company, it would trigger a global banking crisis for the principality. King Edward's pristine economy would face crippling international sanctions. My parents had not just committed identity theft against their older sister, they had unknowingly orchestrated an act of financial terrorism against a sovereign nation. This changes the entire strategy, Jada said, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. We are no longer just filing a civil suit for mortgage fraud and identity theft. Gregory and Brenda have just walked themselves into a federal money laundering indictment. The moment they step foot back on American soil, the FBI will be waiting for them. And Melody loses everything I added. The royal family will not just annul the marriage to protect their image. King Edward will obliterate her to protect his national security. The moment he sees the Interpol red notices attached to her dowry trust, he will treat her as an active threat to the crown. There will be no quiet divorce. There will be an absolute brutal severing. I extracted the Interpol red notices and the FBI case file numbers from my forensic software. I embedded the raw law enforcement data directly into the master dossier. I placed the criminal syndicate connections on the very first page, ensuring it would be the first thing the Cordovian Ministry of Finance saw when they opened the file. I highlighted the exact moment the dirty money entered the royal escrow account, providing the exact transaction hashes required for the royal guards to seize the funds immediately. The dossier was no longer just an audit. It was a digital explosive device. I locked the final encrypted file and secured it on my offline drive. The trap was now fully weaponized. I closed my laptop and stood up from the desk. The morning light was pouring through the thin curtains of the motel room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I walked over to the closet and retrieved my tailored navy suit. I dressed with meticulous care, fastening each button with absolute precision. I tied my hair back into a sleek, severe style, ensuring not a single strand was out of place. I looked at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was not a victim. She was not a discarded sibling or a jealous spinster. She was the architect of their total destruction. I picked up the encrypted hard drive containing the Interpol files, the forged mortgage documents, and the digital execution order for my family. I slipped it into the inner pocket of my blazer. I grabbed my room key and walked out the door, stepping into the crisp morning air. The royal wedding was about to begin, and I had a spectacular gift to deliver. While I was securing a private car to take me from the utilitarian outskirts of the city directly into the heavily fortified royal district, Jada was executing the domestic phase of our operation thousands of miles away in Boston. The morning sun had barely crested the skyline on the East Coast when she marched through the heavy glass doors of the financial institution that had authorized my fraudulent $2 million mortgage. Jada did not just walk into a room, she commanded it. Wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit and carrying a pristine leather briefcase, she bypassed the teller line entirely and approached the executive reception desk. She dropped a stack of legal documentation onto the polished marble counter with a resounding thud. She demanded to see the branch manager immediately. The receptionist attempted to stall, offering corporate platitudes, but Jada slid her senior partner business card across the desk, followed by a drafted but unfiled federal complaint. The receptionist took one look at the bold red lettering indicating massive financial negligence and practically ran to fetch her superior. Within 3 minutes, a sweating branch manager named Mr. Caldwell ushered Jada into his glass-walled office. He attempted to offer her coffee, but Jada cut him off, raising a single hand to stop his pleasantries. Jada did not mince words. She informed him that his branch had just authorized a $2 million second mortgage using stolen identity metrics and forged digital signatures. She explained with ruthless legal precision that the funds had already been wired offshore directly into a blacklisted Cayman Islands shell company currently monitored by federal agents. Mr. Caldwell turned the color of wet ash. He scrambled to his computer, frantically pulling up my account file. He tried to defend his loan officers, claiming the underwriting software had verified my credit score, and the signers had provided appropriate identification. Jada smiled a cold, terrifying smile. She leaned across his desk and informed him that his bank had spectacularly failed basic Know Your Customer compliance laws. She told him that if he did not provide the physical security footage of the signing room from that specific Tuesday afternoon, she would hold the bank legally liable as co-conspirators in an international money laundering scheme. She promised to bury the institution in so much federal litigation they would be paying punitive fines for the next decade. Mr. Caldwell completely broke under the pressure. He picked up his desk phone, called his security director, and ordered him to extract the localized camera feeds immediately. Jada sat in his office and watched the high-definition video play out on his monitor. The footage was crisp and absolutely undeniable. There, sitting at the loan officer's desk, were my parents, Brenda and Gregory. They were laughing and chatting amiably with the bank employee. Gregory handed over a tablet with my forged digital signature, while Brenda produced a falsified power of attorney document that the lazy underwriter completely failed to verify. They looked relaxed and victorious. They were smiling while systematically destroying their oldest daughter's future. Jada forced the manager to export the raw video file onto an encrypted flash drive. She also demanded the unredacted IP logs from the digital signing software and the physical copies of the falsified documents they submitted. Before walking out, she looked Mr. Caldwell dead in the eye and told him to retain his legal counsel because the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be visiting his branch before the end of the week. Jada walked out of the bank with the physical proof we needed to destroy any possible defense my parents might attempt to mount. She drove straight back to her home office and initiated another secure connection with me. I was sitting in the back of my hired car, watching the opulent architecture of the Cordovian Royal District come into view. My laptop was open on my knees, operating on a cellular hotspot. Jada uploaded the raw security footage and the forged power of attorney documents into our shared secure server. I watched the video of my parents smiling as they ruined my financial future. There was no anger left in me, only a cold, clinical satisfaction. They had handed me the exact rope I needed to hang them. Together we began compiling the final master dossier. This was no longer just a collection of suspicious banking anomalies. It was a weaponized, highly classified intelligence file structured exactly like the executive risk assessments I delivered to government agencies. We organized it into 3 devastating sections. Section 1 contained the undeniable proof of domestic identity theft, featuring the bank security footage, the forged signatures, the falsified power of attorney, and the geolocated IP addresses matching their home router. Section 2 detailed the wire fraud tracking the massive $2 million transfer from Boston to Delaware and straight into the Cayman Islands. I included the exact timestamp data, proving they moved the funds immediately after securing the fraudulent loan, indicating premeditated theft. Section 3 was the kill shot. We merged the Interpol red notices and the active FBI tracking data regarding Apex Holdings International, connecting my parents directly to the known criminal syndicate. We layered the routing nodes to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this radioactive dirty money was currently sitting in the pristine royal escrow account of the Cordovian Central Bank, intended to be used as Melody's dowry. We sealed the entire dossier with military-grade encryption. It was airtight, undeniable, and legally lethal. I formatted the summary page to highlight the immediate threat to the Cordovian economy, knowing that King Edward and his financial ministers would read it with absolute horror. My parents had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset, prioritizing their golden child at my expense. They assumed my silence was a sign of weakness. Now they were going to learn that a disposable asset can become a highly unstable explosive. I closed my laptop and looked out the window. The grand spires of the royal palace were looming ahead, and the trap was perfectly primed. The grand spires of the royal palace were looming ahead, and the trap was perfectly primed. The hired car dropped me off back at my obscure motel, just as the sun began to crest over the Cordovian horizon. I paid the driver in cash and walked up the concrete stairs to my room. Today was the day. The entire Principality of Cordovia was waking up in a state of euphoric anticipation. Royal banners fluttered from every street lamp, and the distant sound of cathedral bells began to ring out across the capital. It was a national holiday, a fairy tale broadcast to millions around the globe. Miles away, inside the impenetrable walls of the Grand Cordovian Hotel bridal suite, my sister Melody was living her ultimate fantasy. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how the scene was unfolding. She would be draped in a custom silk robe surrounded by a small army of European stylists and makeup artists. Crystal flutes of vintage champagne would be flowing freely. My parents Brenda and Gregory would be hovering nearby, intoxicating themselves on the sheer opulence of it all. Gregory was likely adjusting his bespoke tuxedo, practicing the patronizing smile he planned to flash at the paparazzi. Brenda was probably standing behind Melody in front of a gilded mirror, weeping tears of absolute triumph. They believed they had executed the perfect crime. They believed they had successfully excised their problematic older daughter and secured a lifetime of unassailable aristocratic privilege. Melody would be staring at her own reflection, admiring the stolen diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was built on a foundation of radioactive federal felonies. She was preparing to walk down the aisle wrapped in a delusion of grandeur, assuming her path to the throne was completely clear. The contrast inside my cramped motel room was absolute. There was no champagne and no silk. There was only the harsh fluorescent light of the bathroom seeping into the main room, the smell of stale air conditioning, and the rhythmic hum of my laptop cooling fan. I sat at the chipped laminate desk, wearing the same clothes I had been wearing for hours. I took a sip of my lukewarm black coffee, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. I did not feel jealous of my sister's pampering. I did not feel a single pang of regret for missing the lavish breakfast spreads or the royal procession. I felt the pure, unadulterated adrenaline of an investigator about to close the biggest case of her life. I opened my encrypted communication terminal. Jada had just sent the final verification code from Boston, confirming that her legal filings were locked and loaded in the federal court system. The domestic side of the trap was armed and waiting. It was time to detonate the international payload. I pulled up the master dossier on my screen. It was a 100-page document of sheer financial devastation. The IP logs, the forged signatures, the Cayman Island shell company routing numbers, the Interpol red notices, and the direct ties to an active international money laundering syndicate were all perfectly formatted. It was the most beautiful spreadsheet I had ever created, a masterpiece of undeniable forensic accounting. I needed to ensure this dossier reached the exact individuals who possessed both the authority and the ruthlessness to act on it immediately. I bypassed the standard royal public relations offices. They would only try to bury the scandal to protect the wedding broadcast. Instead, I targeted the absolute apex of Cordovian financial security. I input the direct encrypted email address of the Cordovian Minister of Finance. I added the Chief Inspector of the Royal Treasury. Finally, I added the personal secure inbox of the Commander of the Royal Guard, the man directly responsible for protecting King Edward from all foreign and domestic threats. For the American flank, I accessed a secure portal utilized by my auditing firm to report severe financial crimes. I routed a copy of the dossier directly to the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in New York. I flagged the transmission with priority codes specifically indicating violations of the Patriot Act and international wire fraud involving a sovereign nation. I knew the agents monitoring that portal. When they saw the connection between a blacklisted Cayman syndicate and a fraudulent $2 million American mortgage, they would not wait for a subpoena. They would mobilize an arrest warrant instantly. I reviewed the recipient list one last time, checking every character of the digital addresses. My finger hovered over the trackpad. This was the point of no return. Once I transmitted these files, the resulting explosion would obliterate my parents' lives entirely. Gregory and Brenda would face federal prison sentences. Melody would face global humiliation and an annulment before her wedding cake was even cut. I thought about the way my mother had looked at me with pure contempt in the hotel lobby. I thought about my father telling me I was a liability and demanding security throw me onto the street. I thought about Melody physically ripping our grandmother's necklace from my skin, laughing at my expense. I pressed down on the trackpad with absolute certainty. Send. The progress bar flashed across my screen. Encrypting payload, establishing secure handshake, transmitting data. I watched the green bar fill up piece by piece. It took exactly 4 seconds for the dossier to leave my motel room and hit the secure servers of the Cordovian government and the United States federal authorities. Message delivered. I leaned back in the stiff wooden chair and exhaled a long, slow breath. The silence in the motel room felt different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a suspended weight dropping. I closed the email client and opened a secure monitoring tool I had designed to track engagement with the dossier. Within 3 minutes, the first red receipt pinged on my screen. The Cordovian Ministry of Finance had opened the file. 2 minutes later, the Royal Treasury accessed the document. 7 minutes later, the federal portal confirmed a successful download. The digital alarms were ringing in the highest corridors of power. Highly trained government analysts were currently staring at their monitors, watching the illusion of the wealthy American bride evaporate into a terrifying national security threat. They were looking at the exact transaction hashes, proving that the $2 million dowry sitting in their pristine royal escrow account was actively monitored cartel money. I closed my laptop entirely. My part in the digital phase of this war was complete. Now it was time for the physical confrontation. I stood up and walked over to the closet. I unzipped the garment bag holding my tailored white suit. It was sharp, immaculate, and projected absolute authority. If I was going to be escorted into the presence of a king, I was going to look like the only person in the room who held the winning hand. I began to dress, moving with deliberate precision, while the entire world prepared to collapse on my sister's fairy tale. I pulled the crisp, white blazer over my shoulders and adjusted the lapels in the cracked mirror of the motel bathroom. The fabric was immaculate, a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper and water-stained tiles surrounding me. I checked my watch. It had been exactly 22 minutes since I hit send on the encrypted master dossier. Back at the desk, my laptop screen was still open, displaying a live diagnostic feed of the secure server where I had hosted the evidence files. I watched the access logs light up like a fireworks display. Deep inside the fortified walls of the Cordovian Ministry of Finance, the morning had undoubtedly started with champagne and celebratory briefings. That festive atmosphere died the exact second the chief inspector of the Royal Treasury opened my priority transmission. I could picture the scene with perfect clarity. A high-ranking financial minister, likely annoyed by an urgent alert on the morning of a national holiday, clicking open the attachment. First, he would see the executive summary detailing domestic identity theft. He might have dismissed that as a tacky American family dispute, but then he would scroll down to Section 2. He would see the wire transfer logs, he would see the routing numbers, and then he would hit Section 3. The access logs on my screen spiked massively. The IP addresses pinging the dossier were multiplying. The file was being forwarded rapidly across the highest echelons of the Cordovian government. They were looking at the Interpol red notices. They were staring at the active federal tracking data imported directly from the United States authorities. They were realizing that the $2 million bridal trust currently resting in their sovereign escrow account was entirely composed of heavily monitored cartel-linked dirty money. I walked over to the desk and watched the server traffic accelerate. The Ministry of Finance was pinging the dossier. The Royal Treasury was downloading the raw transaction hashes. And then a highly classified, restricted IP address accessed the file. It was the personal secure network of King Edward himself. The monarch had been awakened. King Edward was a ruler who had staked his entire legacy on transforming Cordovia into an impenetrable fortress of economic integrity. He was a man who personally vetted foreign investors and ruthlessly expelled anyone with a shadow of financial impropriety. The revelation that his future daughter-in-law was dragging a radioactive money laundering syndicate straight to the steps of the royal altar would be treated as an act of profound aggression. He would not view Melody or her parents as mere grifters. He would view them as a catastrophic national security threat. I calmly disconnected my laptop from the secure network, wiped the temporary cache, and slid the machine into my leather briefcase. I checked my watch again. 41 minutes post-transmission. The digital panic inside the palace would be translating into physical action right about now. The king would demand to know who had breached his banking systems to deliver this intelligence. He would see my digital signature and my credentials as a senior forensic accountant for the very firm that audited his central bank. He would realize that the woman who just saved his kingdom from a devastating international banking crisis was currently sitting in a cheap motel room less than 3 miles away from his throne. I did not have to wait long. The low rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the thin walls of my room. I walked over to the window and parted the dusty curtains just a fraction of an inch. A convoy of 3 black armored tactical vehicles had just pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Transit Depot Motel. They moved with absolute military precision, boxing in all potential exits. These were not local police cruisers. They bore the gold and black crest of the Cordovian Royal Guard. I stepped away from the window, picked up my briefcase, and stood in the center of the room. I smoothed the front of my white suit, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight. A heavy, sharp knock echoed through the door. The sound was authoritative, demanding absolute compliance. I unlocked the deadbolt, slid back the security chain, and pulled the door open. 2 men stood in the outdoor corridor, blocking the morning sun. They wore the ceremonial yet heavily armored uniforms of the elite Royal Protection Detail. Their expressions were unreadable, hidden behind dark sunglasses and decades of disciplined training. They did not draw weapons. They did not reach for handcuffs. The taller guard stepped forward and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound, unexpected respect. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice thick with a crisp European accent. "His Majesty King Edward requests your presence at the palace. Immediately." I met his gaze with absolute icy calm. "I understand," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Lead the way." I stepped out of the dingy motel room, leaving the cheap laminate desk and flickering fluorescent lights behind forever. The guards immediately flanked me, forming a highly protective wedge as we walked down the concrete stairs toward the waiting convoy. The motel clerk who had ignored me the night before was now standing behind his glass counter, staring with wide, terrified eyes as the Royal Military Detail escorted me across his parking lot. One of the guards opened the heavy reinforced door of the lead armored vehicle. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, placing my briefcase on the seat beside me. The doors slammed shut, sealing me inside a quiet, climate-controlled vault. The convoy immediately accelerated, pulling out of the transit depot and turning toward the heart of the city. Through the tinted bulletproof glass, I watched the streets of Cordovia blur past. The city was alive with frenetic, joyous energy. Crowds of citizens were lining the barricaded sidewalks, waving national flags and tossing flower petals in anticipation of the royal procession. They were cheering for a fairy tale that was already dead. They were celebrating a royal bride who was currently sitting on top of a ticking financial time bomb. I leaned back against the plush leather headrest. My parents had told hotel security to throw me out onto the street like garbage. They had assumed I would be paralyzed by shame and financial ruin. Now I was speeding toward the palace under the personal protection of the king himself, holding the absolute power to dismantle their entire existence. The car banked sharply, merging onto the exclusive royal avenue that led directly to the palace gates. The endgame had officially arrived. The black armored convoy glided past the towering ornate iron gates of the royal palace without slowing down. Armed sentries waved us through, parting the sea of cheering tourists and media crews along the perimeter. We bypassed the grand public entrance, navigating instead through a maze of fortified security tunnels reserved exclusively for elite officials and the royal family. The tires hummed against the smooth concrete before the armored vehicle came to a silent halt in a guarded staging area. The door swung open. I stepped out into the cool air. The commander of the Royal Guard met me at the base of a private elevator. He did not ask for my identification. He pressed a keycard to a scanner and gestured inside. We rode the elevator in absolute silence, ascending rapidly toward the main staterooms of the palace. Every single floor we passed represented yet another thick layer of the aristocratic illusion my parents desperately tried to buy. They had sacrificed my entire future just to stand on the other side of the walls I was currently breaching with a government escort. The elevator chimed softly. The steel doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, gilded corridor lined with priceless tapestries and antique marble statues. Security personnel equipped with earpieces lined the hallway, their eyes locked straight ahead as I walked past. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase. Inside were the indisputable digital execution orders meant for my entirely treacherous family. We marched toward a set of massive, ornately carved mahogany doors at the very end of the hall. Behind those doors, the royal reception was currently operating at peak capacity. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was a masterclass in opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the frescoed ceilings, casting a brilliant, glittering light over hundreds of the most elite dignitaries. Immaculate waiters in crisp white gloves circulated seamlessly with silver trays of vintage champagne and beluga caviar. A symphony orchestra positioned on a raised balcony played a sweeping waltz that filled the space. At the center of the dance floor, Melody lived her fantasy. Draped in a silk gown embroidered with pearls, she twirled effortlessly in the arms of Prince Harrison. The stolen diamond pendant rested heavily against her collarbone, a glittering monument to her utter lack of conscience. Television cameras mounted on cranes tracked their movements, broadcasting the fairy tale live to millions globally. Near the perimeter of the dance floor, my parents were thoroughly intoxicating themselves on their newly acquired social power. Brenda held a crystal flute, her emerald dress catching the light, as she laughed too loudly at a joke made by a visiting duke. Gregory stood beside her in his bespoke tuxedo, gesturing expansively while holding court with international ambassadors. They were projecting the perfect image of an aristocratic American dynasty. They looked completely relaxed, believing their massive financial crime was securely buried under my ruined reputation. They were oblivious to the digital hurricane striking the royal treasury. I stood perfectly still just outside the grand ballroom, the heavy mahogany doors towering over me. The commander of the guard touched his earpiece, receiving a final silent confirmation from a superior inside the hall. He looked at me and gave a single sharp nod. Two massive royal guards stepped forward, placed their gloved hands on the brass handles, and shoved the heavy wooden doors violently open. The sound was like a thunderclap echoing through the cavernous space. The heavy doors slammed against the marble walls with a tremendous thud. The immediate impact was catastrophic. The lead conductor of the symphony orchestra, startled by the aggressive breach, dropped his baton. The sweeping waltz dissolved into a chaotic, screeching discord of confused string instruments before dying out completely. A profound, suffocating silence instantly slammed down over the entire ballroom. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. The television cameras pivoted aggressively on their mechanical arms, zooming in to capture the sudden disturbance. The royal guests parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in shocked, hushed whispers. Right in the middle of the dance floor, Prince Harrison stopped moving. Melody froze mid-twirl, her silk gown settling heavily around her ankles. She turned her head toward the entrance, an annoyed aristocratic scowl forming on her lips, fully prepared to berate whichever clumsy servant had interrupted her globally televised spotlight. Instead, her eyes locked directly onto mine. The blood drained out of her face so fast she looked physically ill. I stepped across the threshold and walked into the grand ballroom. I was not the broken, weeping addict they had described to the tabloids. I was not the jealous, plain spinster they had laughed at in the hotel lobby. I wore a tailored white suit that radiated absolute lethal authority. I was flanked by 4 heavily armed members of the elite royal protection detail men who answered only to the king himself. My posture was impeccably straight, my expression an icy, unreadable mask. Every click of my heels against the polished marble floor echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent room. I walked with the slow, deliberate pacing of an apex predator cornering its prey. Across the room, Gregory dropped his champagne flute. The expensive crystal shattered against the floor, splashing vintage wine over his polished shoes. Brenda grabbed his arm, her emerald dress suddenly looking cheap and ridiculous as pure, unadulterated terror seized her features. They recognized the royal guards flanking me. They recognized the leather briefcase in my hand. They realized in one horrifying, paralyzing instant that I was not there to beg for an invitation. I was there as an emissary of the crown. I kept my eyes locked onto Melody as I advanced toward the center of the dance floor. The fake princess was trembling, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip his arm just to stay standing. She looked at the stolen diamond against her neck, then back to my face. It evaporated. The illusion of her royalty vanished into the cold air of the ballroom. I stood a mere 10 feet away from the center of the dance floor. The elite royal guards fanned out, forming a tight perimeter around me. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to move. The television cameras remained locked on my face, broadcasting this exact moment to millions of viewers watching from their living rooms across the globe. From the elevated royal dais at the far end of the Grand Hall, King Edward rose from his gilded chair. He was an imposing monarch who ruled with an iron grip on his nation's financial purity for 3 decades. The gold medals adorning his military uniform clinked softly as he descended the marble stairs. The guests bowed their heads instinctively as he passed, but his eyes remained entirely focused on me. He bypassed his son. He bypassed the trembling bride. He walked directly into my perimeter. King Edward stopped right in front of me. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly grave. He extended his right hand. I took it, and he offered a firm, respectful handshake that sent a shockwave of collective gasps rippling through the aristocratic crowd. "Thank you, Miss Williams," the king said, his voice echoing clearly across the cavernous ballroom. "Your exceptional service to the crown today will never be forgotten. You have saved this kingdom from a catastrophic breach of security." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Gregory staggered backward, bumping into a waiter. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a frantic, trapped panic. Melody looked back and forth between the king and me, her jaw trembling as she struggled to comprehend how the sister she had banished was now receiving royal gratitude. I released the monarch's hand and gave a respectful nod. "It is my professional duty, Your Majesty," I replied smoothly. I turned my attention to Prince Harrison. He stood rigid confusion and growing horror fighting for dominance on his handsome face. I unlatched my leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed like a ticking clock. I reached inside and withdrew the master dossier bound in black cardstock and stamped with the official seal of my forensic auditing firm. I extended the physical copy of the dossier directly to Prince Harrison. He took it hesitantly as if the paper itself might burn his hands. "Your Highness," I said, projecting my voice so the cameras and the silent crowd could capture every single syllable. "You believe you are marrying an heiress from an old money American dynasty. You believe the $2 million bridal trust currently resting in your sovereign escrow account is a demonstration of generational wealth. It is not." Prince Harrison opened the heavy cover of the dossier. His eyes scanned the first page, the executive summary detailing the wire fraud. He looked up, his face draining of color. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. I kept my posture rigid and my tone utterly clinical. "That is a comprehensive forensic audit," I stated. "Your bride and her parents are broke. They filed for bankruptcy 5 years ago. To buy her way into your family, my parents committed massive domestic identity theft. They forged my signature and weaponized my pristine credit history to take out a fraudulent $2 million mortgage on a commercial property I legally co-own. The money you require as a royal dowry is entirely stolen." Melody lunged forward, reaching out to grab the dossier from the prince's hands. "Harrison, do not listen to her," she shrieked, echoing terribly in the quiet ballroom. "She is a jealous, unstable addict. My public relations team warned you about her. She is just trying to ruin my life because she has nothing." Prince Harrison pulled the dossier out of her reach, stepping away from her as if she were contagious. He flipped to the second section of the document. He saw the bank security camera footage stills. He saw the forged power of attorney. He saw the undeniable proof of Gregory and Brenda smiling as they finalized the massive theft. "Audrey, please," Gregory begged from the sidelines, his voice pathetic and hollow. "We can explain everything. Let us just go to a private room. We can fix this." I did not even look in his direction. "There is no private room, Gregory," I said, cutting off his frantic pleas. "You wanted a globally televised wedding. You wanted the entire world to look at your family. Now they are looking." I turned my focus back to Prince Harrison, who was now staring at the third section of the dossier. He had reached the absolute kill shot. Identity theft and mortgage fraud are federal crimes. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy ballroom air. But that is not why the king just thanked me. That is not why the royal guards are standing behind me. When your future father-in-law decided to funnel that stolen $2 million into your pristine country, he did not use a clean financial vehicle. He bought an offshore shell company to wash the money. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Melody. The stolen diamond pendant on her neck caught the light of the chandeliers. He routed your dowry through Apex Holdings International, I announced, making sure my diction was flawless. That specific shell company is a known money laundering artery for an international criminal syndicate. It is currently under active joint investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Interpol. My parents took dirty cartel-linked routing numbers and plugged them directly into your royal treasury. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a total systemic collapse. Prince Harrison dropped the dossier onto a nearby silver tray. He looked at Melody with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She had brought a radioactive federal investigation to the very steps of the royal altar. She had infected a sovereign nation with illicit funds just to play pretend. Brenda let out a sudden sharp wail and collapsed onto her knees right there on the polished marble floor. Her emerald gown pooled around her as she began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest. Gregory stood frozen, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Melody backed away from the prince, shaking her head in violent denial. "No," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her expertly applied makeup. "No, it is a mistake. I am going to be a princess. I am going to be a princess." "You are a massive liability," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. "And you are currently holding my grandmother's necklace." The royal guard stepped forward, moving into a tactical formation around the disgraced bride and her paralyzed parents. The financial execution was complete. The fairy tale was dead. I stood in the center of the devastated ballroom, the undisputed victor of a war they had foolishly started. Brenda scrambled up from the polished marble floor. Her emerald gown was wrinkled and her carefully sprayed hair had fallen out of place, but her survival instincts were kicking in. She was a woman who had spent her entire life manipulating reality to fit her narrative. When cornered, she always reverted to her favorite weapon: gaslighting. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and let out a theatrical wail. "Do not listen to her. She is sick. She is completely out of her mind." Brenda turned her frantic gaze to King Edward and Prince Harrison, spreading her hands in a gesture of maternal despair. "Your Majesty, please forgive this horrific display. My oldest daughter is having a severe mental breakdown. We tried to get her psychiatric help in the United States, but she refused. She has been struggling with severe addiction and paranoid delusions." Gregory, sensing a lifeline, instantly joined the performance. He straightened his ruined tuxedo and stepped forward, adopting the solemn tone of a heartbroken patriarch. "It is true, Your Highness. Audrey has been deeply unwell for years. The stress of her corporate job finally broke her. She fabricated this entire financial conspiracy out of pure jealousy because she cannot stand to see her sister happy. All these documents are the ravings of an unstable mind. She needs to be in a hospital, not a royal ballroom." Melody nodded vigorously, wiping her tears and clinging to her shredded dignity. "She is obsessed with me. She has always tried to destroy my happiness. Please, Harrison, send her away before she hurts someone." The aristocratic guests murmured among themselves. The public relations smear campaign my family had paid for was still fresh in their minds. Some of the visiting dignitaries exchanged uncertain glances. The lie was audacious, but it was delivered with such desperate conviction that a lesser opponent might have faltered. I did not falter. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my sanity or list my professional credentials. Engaging with a gaslighter only gives oxygen to their fire. Instead, I stood perfectly still and allowed their frantic, desperate voices to echo off the frescoed ceiling until the silence rushed back in. I turned slightly and made a deliberate, subtle nod toward a man standing just to the right of the king. He was the king's senior communications advisor. He stepped forward, holding a sleek, high-definition tablet connected directly to the grand ballroom's state-of-the-art audio-visual system. I do not need to argue with you, I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm. The truth does not require a performance. The advisor tapped the screen of his tablet. Instantly, the massive digital projection screens meant to display rolling photographs of the happy royal couple flickered to life. The audio feed piped directly through the symphony orchestra's towering surround sound speakers. On the massive screens, an exceptionally sharp video feed materialized. It was Jada sitting behind the massive mahogany desk of her Boston law office, wearing a tailored suit and exuding absolute authority. "Good evening, Your Majesty and distinguished guests," Jada said, her voice projecting crisp and clear across the silent ballroom. "My name is Jada Williams. I am a senior corporate attorney at a top-tier law firm in the United States, and Audrey is my sister-in-law. I am currently transmitting this feed directly from Boston, where I have spent the morning compiling physical evidence of massive federal fraud." Brenda let out a sharp gasp. Gregory took a step backward, his face draining of whatever color had returned. They knew Jada. They knew she was ruthless, brilliant, and completely immune to their manipulations. "My parents-in-law have just attempted to claim that Audrey is suffering from a paranoid delusion." Jada continued, her tone laced with absolute clinical precision. "They claim the forged mortgage and the stolen funds are a fabrication. Let us test that theory against the surveillance footage extracted this morning from the First National Bank of Boston under threat of a federal subpoena." Jada tapped a key on her keyboard. The video on the massive ballroom screens shifted. The live feed of Jada was replaced by high-resolution black and white security footage. The timestamp in the corner clearly displayed a date from 3 weeks ago. There, sitting comfortably in a plush bank office, were Brenda and Gregory. The resolution was so clear that the attendees in the ballroom could see the brand of Gregory's watch. The bank loan officer slid a tablet across the desk. The audio from the security feed crackled to life, echoing through the speakers. Gregory's voice filled the Cordovian ballroom. He was laughing. "Audrey is always too busy working to manage the property properly," Gregory said on the recording, taking the stylus. "It is a good thing she gave us power of attorney to handle this refinancing. She trusts her old man to make the smart investments." Brenda leaned in, smiling brightly. "Yes, she is just thrilled to help her little sister secure a solid foundation for the wedding. She told us to take out as much as the equity allows." Gregory signed the digital document with a flourish. The forgery was captured in high definition from 3 different angles. The ballroom was paralyzed. The evidence was irrefutable. But Jada was not finished. "That footage establishes the forgery," Jada announced, her voice cutting back in over the speakers. "Now let us address the intent to ruin Audrey." 2 nights ago, Gregory left a voicemail on my husband Derek's private phone explaining why they had to kick Audrey out of the hotel. Derek was horrified and immediately turned the recording over to my legal team. A new audio file began to play. This time, it was just a voice recording, but the quality was pristine. Gregory's arrogant hushed tone filled the grand hall. "Derek, you need to stop worrying about Audrey," he hissed on the tape. "We had to get her out of the hotel before she checked her bank accounts. The mortgage cleared, but the first payment is due next week, and we are obviously not paying it. The bank is going to freeze her credit. She is going to be ruined. If she is sitting in the royal palace when that happens, she will make a scene and ruin Melody's dowry presentation. We had to isolate her. By the time she figures out her credit is tanked, the wedding will be over and the money will be secured in the royal trust. She can cry all she wants from a cheap motel room. She is the sacrifice we had to make for the family legacy." The recording clicked off. The crushing silence that returned to the ballroom was heavy enough to break bones. The gaslighting was completely, utterly obliterated. There was no room left for misinterpretation. There was no room left for excuses. The guests stared at my parents with expressions of profound disgust. Aristocrats physically stepped backward, creating a wide circle of isolation around Brenda and Gregory. Prince Harrison looked physically sick. He turned away from Melody, unable to even look at her face. King Edward stood tall, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. The monarch of a nation built on financial integrity had just listened to a man brag about destroying his own daughter's life to commit fraud against the crown. Brenda dropped her face into her hands, weeping violently. There were no fake tears this time. It was the visceral sobbing of a woman who knew her entire life was over. Gregory stared blankly at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the posture of a man walking to the gallows. I looked at Melody. The stolen diamond pendant resting against her collarbone no longer looked like a royal heirloom. It looked like a heavy chained anchor dragging her down to the bottom of the ocean. She had wanted to play the role of an old money aristocrat. Instead, she had just been exposed as the beneficiary of a cheap, devastatingly cruel criminal conspiracy. The royal guards tightened their perimeter around my family. The truth was out. The execution of justice was complete. They had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Prince Harrison stepped fully out of the protective shadow of his father's royal advisors. He looked down at Melody, who was still kneeling on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the shredded remnants of her fabricated life. The grand ballroom remained entirely silent, the orchestra frozen, the elite guests holding their collective breath. The television cameras focused tightly on the prince's face, capturing the profound disgust etching deep lines around his eyes. He did not look like a heartbroken groom. He looked like a man who had just narrowly avoided stepping onto a live landmine. Melody reached out her hands, shaking violently. "Harrison," she pleaded, her voice a desperate, high-pitched whine. "You know me. You know my heart. I did not understand the financial details. My parents handled the trusts. I only wanted to be with you. We can move past this. We love each other." Prince Harrison recoiled, stepping backward as if her outstretched fingers were dripping with poison. "Do not dare speak to me of love," he said, his voice echoing with aristocratic finality. "You brought a federal money laundering syndicate to the gates of my home. You allowed your parents to funnel illicit criminal capital into my nation's sovereign treasury. You stole from your own sister and then stood before my family smiling while your public relations team attempted to destroy her sanity in the global press." He shook his head, looking at her white silk gown with absolute revulsion. "It is not just the lack of wealth that disgusts me, Melody. It is the profound, bottomless lack of character. You are a dangerous, reckless fraud. You are nothing but a parasite dressed in stolen silk." Melody let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She looked toward our parents, but Brenda and Gregory were currently pinned under the unrelenting gaze of the armed royal guards, completely incapable of offering their golden child any salvation. The aristocratic guests who had spent the last 2 days fawning over the beautiful American bride now looked at her with undisguised contempt. The high society elite of Cordovia valued pedigree and honor above all else, and my family had just demonstrated a horrifying absence of both. King Edward stepped forward, the gold embellishments on his military uniform catching the harsh glare of the television lighting. He raised his right hand, and a wave of absolute silence crashed over the room once again. He was the undisputed monarch of Cordovia, and he was about to deliver a legal execution on live international television. This institution is built upon the pillars of absolute integrity and unwavering transparency. King Edward announced, his voice booming through the grand hall with terrifying authority. "We do not tolerate deception, we do not harbor criminals, and we certainly do not allow our royal lineage to be contaminated by international fraud." The king looked directly at the television cameras, ensuring his decree would be recorded in the annals of global history. "As sovereign of Cordovia, I hereby invoke my absolute executive authority regarding matters of the crown. This marriage was predicated on severe malicious fraud. It was orchestrated through domestic identity theft and international money laundering. Therefore, it is legally invalid. I decree this union annulled immediately. It is permanently void." Melody screamed, a visceral, horrific sound that echoed against the frescoed ceilings. "No, you cannot do this. I am a princess. We said our vows. I am your wife, Harrison. You are a trespasser." The king corrected her, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "And you are currently in possession of property belonging to the crown." King Edward gave a sharp, definitive nod to his right. The head of royal protocol, a stern, formidable woman flanked by 2 female security officers, stepped forward. They moved with mechanical, ruthless efficiency. They approached Melody, who was now sobbing hysterically on the floor. The protocol officer reached down and grasped the heavy diamond-encrusted tiara resting in Melody's perfectly styled hair. Melody tried to pull away, clutching her head, but the security officers firmly held her shoulders in place. With a sharp upward motion, the protocol officer unpinned the tiara, tearing several strands of blonde hair in the process. Melody shrieked as the physical symbol of her aristocratic delusion was violently ripped away from her. The officer placed the priceless artifact onto a velvet tray, held by an attending servant. Next, the officers demanded her hands. Melody sobbed violently, but she had absolutely no leverage against the armed security detail. They systematically stripped the heavy diamond rings from her fingers. They unclasped the platinum bracelets from her wrists. Every single piece of jewelry that the royal family had loaned her for the wedding broadcast was ruthlessly repossessed right in front of the flashing cameras. Finally, the protocol officer reached for the delicate vintage diamond pendant resting against Melody's collarbone. The heirloom she had stolen from me in the hotel room just 48 hours prior. Melody clutched the diamond fiercely, her last desperate attempt to hold on to something valuable. "It is mine," she wept. "It is my family heirloom." The protocol officer looked to me for confirmation. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between myself and my shattered sister. "That belongs to me," I stated, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing. "You took it from my neck and told me a future princess deserved it more. You are not a princess, Melody. You are just a criminal waiting for a federal indictment." The security officer forcefully pried Melody's fingers open. The protocol officer unclasped the gold chain and respectfully handed the diamond pendant directly to me. I slipped it into the pocket of my white tailored suit. The reclamation was complete. The final physical tie between us was severed. "Get them out of my sight," King Edward commanded, waving a dismissive hand toward the crumpled heap of my family. The royal guards immediately converged. 2 massive officers hauled Gregory up by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. Brenda shrieked, kicking her expensive heels against the marble floor as she was dragged upward by her arms. Melody was pulled to her feet, sobbing so violently she could barely stand, her white silk gown now stained and crushed under the weight of her massive humiliation. "You are being expelled from the Principality of Cordovia," the commander of the Royal Guard informed them, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You will be escorted directly to the royal airstrip and placed on a secured transport back to the United States. Your luggage will be forwarded to federal authorities." "Audrey, please," Brenda screamed, as the guards began dragging her toward the heavy mahogany doors. "Please tell them to stop. We are your family. We are your blood." I stood shoulder to shoulder with the King of Cordovia, watching the architects of my lifelong misery being forcibly marched out of the grand ballroom. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let the absolute finality of my revenge wash over me. "My blood is in Boston working on a federal complaint," I replied, knowing Jada was watching the live feed. "Have a safe flight home." The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind them, severing their screams from the ballroom. The fairy tale was violently legally terminated. The fake crown was destroyed, and I was the one holding the hammer. The heavy mahogany doors had slammed shut, sealing their fate in Cordovia, but for Gregory, Brenda, and Melody, the true nightmare was only just beginning. Stripped of their passports and royal privileges, they were shoved into the back of an unmarked security transport van and driven to a remote airstrip. There was no red carpet. There were no flashing cameras or cheering crowds. They were loaded onto a stark, utilitarian cargo plane, chartered explicitly for their immediate deportation. The plush leather seats and vintage champagne they had grown accustomed to were replaced by stiff canvas jump seats and harsh overhead lighting. For the duration of the 12-hour transatlantic flight, the toxic family dynamic that had sustained them for decades finally collapsed inward, eating itself alive. Stripped of their common enemy, they turned their viciousness on each other. Melody sat shivering in the corner, her ruined silk wedding gown stained with spilled wine and dirt from the marble floor. She shrieked at her parents, blaming their cheap, sloppy financial scheming for destroying her one chance at global aristocracy. She screamed that they had ruined her life completely, ignoring the fact that she had gleefully participated in the destruction of mine. Brenda wept hysterically, not out of remorse but out of absolute self-pity. She rocked back and forth mourning the loss of her emerald gowns, her country club status, and the bragging rights she had banked on. She lashed out at Gregory, accusing him of being a reckless fool who could not even execute a simple mortgage fraud without getting caught by a forensic accountant. Gregory paced the narrow metal floor of the cargo hold, his ruined, bespoke tuxedo hanging off his shoulders like a garbage bag. He was sweating profusely, trying to spin a new web of lies. He kept muttering that they could fix this. He insisted they just needed to hire a defense attorney back in Boston, file for bankruptcy a second time, and claim that Audrey had willingly given them the funds before having a sudden change of heart. He actually believed his own delusions. He thought the American justice system would treat this as a simple family dispute over a property loan. He had absolutely no comprehension of the catastrophic federal avalanche Jada had initiated. The cargo plane began its steep descent into New York. The Manhattan skyline broke through the clouds, a towering monument to the financial power I wielded. As the landing gear hit the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Gregory adjusted his tie and told his wife and daughter to stand up straight. He commanded them to keep their heads down, grab a taxi, and retreat to their estate in Connecticut. He promised them they would lay low for a few months, let the tabloid scandal die down, and rebrand themselves. He honestly expected to slink away in shame and hide behind the gates of their suburban mansion. The plane taxied away from the commercial gates, rolling toward an isolated, highly secure customs terminal reserved for flagged international deportations. The heavy metal doors of the aircraft whined open. A steep set of metal stairs was rolled up to the exit. Gregory stepped out first, projecting a pathetic, crumbling aura of false confidence. Brenda followed, holding her designer handbag like a shield, while Melody trailed behind, clutching the torn skirts of her wedding dress. They walked down the metal stairs, expecting to find a bored, sleepy customs agent ready to stamp their temporary entry papers. Instead, they stepped onto the tarmac and walked directly into a heavily armed federal ambush. The private terminal was swarming with federal law enforcement. Over 24 agents wearing navy blue windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stood in a perfectly coordinated tactical blockade. Flanking them were representatives from the Department of Homeland Security and financial crimes investigators from the Treasury Department. The flashing red and blue lights of unmarked federal vehicles illuminated the dark tarmac, casting harsh, terrifying shadows across my family's faces. Gregory froze, his polished shoes locking onto the concrete. The false confidence evaporated from his body in a single paralyzing heartbeat. Brenda let out a high, strangled gasp, dropping her designer handbag onto the tarmac. Melody backed up against the metal railing of the stairs, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. They were finally looking at the real-world consequences of their aristocratic cosplay. A senior FBI special agent stepped forward from the barricade. He did not look amused, and he certainly did not care about their country club status. He held a thick stack of federal warrants in his left hand, the exact documents Jada had pushed through the federal court system while they were in the air. Gregory Williams, Brenda Williams, and Melody Williams, the agent announced, his voice booming over the roar of distant jet engines. You are all being placed under immediate federal arrest. Wait, there is a misunderstanding? Gregory stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. We have a family dispute regarding a property loan. We have lawyers. You cannot do this. The agent did not even blink. He signaled to his tactical team. 6 heavily armed agents moved forward with absolute terrifying precision. They grabbed Gregory by the shoulders, spinning him around and slamming his chest against the side of the transport plane. Gregory Williams, you are being charged with severe wire fraud, aggravated domestic identity theft, and bank fraud. The agent read from the warrant, his voice cutting through the cold airport air. Furthermore, you are facing multiple counts of international money laundering in direct connection to a blacklisted Cayman Islands criminal syndicate currently under Interpol surveillance. The metallic, heavy click of steel handcuffs echoed across the tarmac. Gregory let out a pathetic, broken sob as the cold steel locked his wrists securely behind his back. 2 female agents grabbed Brenda, ignoring her hysterical screams. She thrashed and kicked, begging them to let her go, shrieking that she was a respectable woman and that her daughter was an executive accountant. The agent sufficiently pinned her arms and slapped the cuffs onto her wrists, reading her the exact same list of devastating federal charges. She was an active co-conspirator in the $2 million theft, and the federal government was treating her as a high-level flight risk. Finally, the agents converged on Melody. The bride attempted to use her fabricated status one last time. "You cannot touch me," she screamed, thrashing against the officers. "I am a Cordovian royal. I have diplomatic immunity. Call Prince Harrison. Call the king." The arresting agent let out a dry, humorless scoff. "You are an unemployed American citizen, holding $2 million of cartel-linked money in a fraudulent trust," he corrected her sharply. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Melody wept violently as the handcuffs snapped shut over the sleeves of her ruined silk gown. The fairy tale bride was now fully restrained, treated exactly like the common criminal she was. The agents grabbed them by their arms and began the humiliating perp walk across the tarmac. They were paraded past the flashing lights of the federal vehicles, their faces captured by the dash cameras of the arresting officers. They had wanted the entire world to look at them. They had wanted to be the center of international attention. Now they were getting exactly what they asked for. There would be no sprawling Connecticut estate to hide in. There would be no expensive lawyers to bail them out because the FBI was currently seizing every single asset they owned. They were being shoved into the back of federal transport vans, headed directly to a maximum security holding facility in Manhattan. Their lives of luxury manipulation and unchecked toxicity had officially reached their terminal destination. While my biological family was being processed through the bleak, sterile intake rooms of a federal detention center in Lower Manhattan, I was experiencing a very different kind of homecoming. I flew back to New York 48 hours after the royal annulment on a commercial flight paid for by my own legitimate funds. I did not need a private jet to validate my worth. When my heels clicked against the polished floors of the terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport, there were no tactical teams waiting in the shadows. There was only the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who had just executed a flawless checkmate on an international stage. The next morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of my auditing firm's headquarters on Wall Street. Just days prior, my corporate access had been revoked, and my reputation hung in the balance of a vicious tabloid smear campaign. Today, the atmosphere was entirely unrecognizable. The security guards at the front desk practically stood at attention as I approached. Whispers followed me through the sleek modern corridors. The news of the Cordovian scandal had shattered the global financial sector. Everyone in the building knew that I was the lone forensic accountant who had traced the cartel funds and prevented a sovereign economic collapse. My phone buzzed with an urgent calendar invite before I even reached my desk. Mr. Campbell, my managing partner, was requesting my presence in the executive boardroom. I did not rush. I took my time pouring a cup of coffee, savoring the rich aroma, before taking the elevator to the top floor. When I pushed open the frosted glass doors of the boardroom, the entire executive committee was seated around the massive oak table. Mr. Campbell stood up immediately, his face a complex mixture of profound relief and deep professional embarrassment. "Audrey," he began, his voice carrying a deferential tone I had never heard him use before. "We owe you a monumental apology. The internal investigation is obviously closed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation contacted our legal department yesterday to commend the absolute precision of your dossier. You did not just protect the firm. You elevated our standing with every federal agency in the country." I took a seat at the head of the table, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. I remained perfectly silent, letting him scramble to fill the void. "The board has convened this morning to make this right," Mr. Campbell continued, sliding a thick leather-bound folder across the polished wood. "We are offering you immediate reinstatement with full back pay. But beyond that, we are offering you an accelerated elevation to senior partner. You will have your own division, complete autonomy, and a compensation package that reflects your indispensable value to this organization." I opened the folder. The numbers printed on the contract were staggering. It was the kind of partnership offer accountants spent 30 years bleeding for. Before I could respond, my phone chimed with a secure incoming transmission. I glanced at the screen. The sender was the Cordovian Ministry of Finance acting under the direct executive authority of King Edward. I smiled, closing the leather folder and sliding it back across the table. "That is an incredibly generous offer, Mr. Campbell," I said, my voice steady and cold. But my career trajectory has shifted over the past few days. I picked up my phone and showed him the secure digital contract that had just materialized in my inbox. King Edward had formally dismissed his previous international risk assessment team. In their place, he was offering me a multi-million-dollar independent consulting retainer. He wanted me exclusively. He demanded the woman who could single-handedly dismantle a cartel laundering operation from a cheap motel room to personally oversee the security of his royal treasury. "I am resigning from the firm effective immediately," I announced, standing up from the heavy leather chair. "I appreciate the partnership offer, but I no longer have any interest in climbing a corporate ladder. I am building my own." I left the executive boardroom in stunned silence and walked out of the building. The crisp New York air tasted like absolute freedom. I had a massive royal contract in my digital wallet, and I knew exactly who I needed to partner with to execute it. While I was severing my ties with the corporate world, Jada was performing an even more ruthless amputation uptown. She had returned to the luxury condominium she shared with my older brother Derek. Derek had spent the last 48 hours watching the news cycle completely paralyze his family. He had watched his parents and his golden child sister get dragged across the tarmac in federal handcuffs on every major news network. When Jada walked into their living room, Derek was pacing frantically, clutching his phone. "Jada," he stammered, his face pale with panic. "You have to help them. You are a senior corporate lawyer. You know the federal prosecutors. You have to arrange bail for Mom and Dad. They are terrified." Jada dropped her pristine briefcase onto the kitchen island and looked at her husband with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Your parents forged your sister's signature to steal $2 million, Derek," she stated, her voice dropping to a lethal calm. "They routed that money through a cartel-linked syndicate to buy Melody a fake aristocratic title. They tried to destroy Audrey entirely." "They made a terrible mistake," Derek pleaded, grabbing the edge of the counter. "But they are family, Jada. We have to protect family." Jada let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You knew they were toxic, Derek. You knew they treated Audrey like a disposable asset for decades. You watched them drain her finances and mock her career, and you stood by in absolute cowardly silence because you did not want to lose your spot in their will. You are weak. You are complicit, and I refuse to anchor my life to a man who lacks a spine." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slammed them down onto the granite countertop right in front of him. Derek flinched. "Those are divorce papers," Jada announced. "I filed them this morning. I am taking my assets, my reputation, and my maiden name. I suggest you find a very cheap defense attorney for your parents because the federal government is going to seize every dime of their fraudulent wealth. Do not ever call me again." Jada walked out of the condominium, leaving Derek standing alone in the wreckage of his own cowardly complicity. She did not look back. She hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to an upscale restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. I was sitting in a private leather booth, waiting for her when she arrived. Jada slid into the seat across from me, signaling the waiter for a bottle of vintage champagne. Her dark eyes were blazing with fierce, triumphant energy. We did not need to exchange words about the fallout. The execution had been flawless. I pulled out my laptop and turned the screen toward her, displaying the multi-million-dollar retainer contract from King Edward. Jada leaned forward, scanning the terms with her razor-sharp legal mind. She smiled, a slow, predatory expression that matched my own. "I need a ruthless legal mind to handle the compliance structure for Cordovian banking regulations," I told her, pouring the champagne into our crystal flutes. "I need someone who knows how to spot a fraudulent trust from a mile away." Jada picked up her glass. "And I need a brilliant forensic accountant to help me launch the most elite financial law and risk management firm on the East Coast," she replied. We clinked our glasses together, the sharp, crisp sound ringing out in the quiet restaurant. We were no longer just sisters-in-law tied together by a toxic bloodline. We were business partners. We were two incredibly capable, independent women who had watched a family of narcissistic parasites try to destroy us. Instead of breaking, we pooled our resources, our brilliance, and our absolute refusal to be victimized. We formed our own chosen family. Within a month, Williams and Associates officially opened its doors in a sleek, high-rise office overlooking Central Park. Jada handled the intricate corporate litigation, while I dominated the forensic financial audits. We were an unstoppable machine. We stripped the power away from those who thought they could manipulate us, and built an empire of our own entirely grounded in hard facts, cold numbers, and unshakable loyalty. 1 year later, the New York City skyline stretched out before me, a glittering ocean of glass and steel. I stood on the wraparound terrace of my new Manhattan penthouse, leaning against the glass railing. The autumn air was crisp and carried the electric hum of the city below. I took a slow sip of a remarkably rare vintage red wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my palate. The crystal glass caught the ambient light from the city, a sharp contrast to the cheap paper cup of bitter coffee I had consumed in that obscure Cordovian motel room exactly 12 months ago. I heard the soft click of sliding glass doors behind me. Jada stepped out onto the terrace carrying her own glass of wine and a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. She wore a stunning emerald green pantsuit, her presence radiating the kind of effortless, unshakable power we had built our entire firm upon. We were no longer just surviving the corporate grind. We were dictating the terms of the financial world. King Edward just officially countersigned the renewal contract for our risk assessment services, Jada announced, coming to stand beside me at the railing. She handed me the portfolio. He authorized a 20% increase on the retainer. The Royal Treasury specifically requested that you personally oversee the integration of their new anti-money laundering protocols. I smiled, looking down at the heavy parchment paper bearing the royal seal of Cordovia. It was a flawless victory. Williams and Associates had become the most feared and respected financial law and forensic accounting firm on the Eastern Seaboard. We did not just audit wealth. We protected sovereign economies. Jada and I had forged a bond that transcended the toxic bloodlines we had both severed. We were true partners. We were chosen family. We protected each other, and we built an empire where loyalty was proven through absolute integrity, not blind obedience. I handed the portfolio back to Jada and turned my gaze back to the glowing city skyline. It was hard to fathom how completely the universe had rebalanced itself in just 365 days. The scales of justice had not just tipped, they had slammed down with bone-crushing force. My parents, Brenda and Gregory, were currently adapting to a very different kind of living arrangement. There were no more country club dinners. There were no more luxury leased vehicles or grand estates in the suburbs. Following the undeniable mountain of digital evidence I had handed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their high-priced defense attorney had strongly advised them to take a plea deal. They had absolutely no leverage to fight the charges of severe wire fraud and international money laundering. The judge had been entirely merciless during sentencing, citing their shocking willingness to destroy their own daughter for a superficial social climb. Gregory was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. Brenda was serving 8 years in a federal prison camp for women. The government had seized every single asset they owned to pay back the bank and cover the massive punitive fines. The suburban mansion was auctioned off. Their bank accounts were liquidated. They were stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their freedom. They were completely isolated, forced to spend the next decade wearing standard-issue federal jumpsuits instead of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. And then there was Melody. The spectacular implosion of her royal fairy tale had left her entirely radioactive in high society circles. The annulment had been swift and brutal. King Edward made certain that the global press knew exactly why the American bride had been expelled from Cordovia. The elite aristocrats and wealthy socialites Melody had spent her entire life desperately trying to impress now treated her like a contagious disease. No billionaire wanted to be associated with a woman whose family had attempted to funnel cartel money into a sovereign treasury. Without our parents' stolen funds to subsidize her lavish lifestyle, Melody had crashed into a harsh, unforgiving reality. Bankruptcy had wiped out whatever scraps she had left. Last I heard, my former golden child sister was working a minimum-wage retail job at a luxury department store on Fifth Avenue. She spent her days folding the exact silk dresses she used to buy and ringing up the credit cards of the wealthy women she used to envy. She had to smile and serve the very people who had watched her global humiliation on television. She had no prince. She had no trust fund. She had no family to bail her out. She had nothing but the agonizing daily reminder of the empire she had lost, because she decided to steal my grandmother's necklace and throw me out on the street. As for Derek, he had quietly faded into total obscurity. After Jada finalized their divorce and stripped away the prestigious lifestyle she had provided for him, he was forced to downsize into a mediocre apartment. He was too cowardly to visit our parents in federal prison and too weak to rebuild his own life. He was a spectator to his own failure. I took another slow sip of the vintage wine, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. I looked at Jada, who was raising her glass toward the glittering skyline in a silent toast to everything we had conquered. We had taken the absolute worst betrayal imaginable and weaponized it into an untouchable fortress of success. People often confuse the appearance of wealth with actual strength, I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying into the crisp night air. They think that wearing a designer dress or standing next to a royal title somehow makes them invincible. They mistake manipulation for intelligence and cruelty for power, but they are always wrong. I turned away from the city lights and looked directly ahead. True power is not a borrowed crown. It is knowing exactly how to follow the money. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. Navigating a toxic family dynamic can be one of the most isolating and devastating experiences a person can face, but you do not have to carry their burdens forever. Have you ever had to draw a massive line in the sand and set a hard, permanent boundary with a toxic family member who tried to manipulate your life? How did you finally break free from their control and reclaim your own power? I would absolutely love to hear your stories of survival and success in the comments section down below. Your experiences matter, and your strength can inspire someone else who is currently fighting their own battle. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more content about overcoming betrayal and building a beautiful independent life, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay strong, trust your own instincts, and always remember your true worth. The harrowing journey of Audrey facing her family's ultimate betrayal illuminates a profound truth about personal empowerment and resilience. When her parents and sister systematically stripped away her familial safety net to construct a fragile illusion of aristocratic wealth, they operated under the arrogant assumption that she would silently crumble under the weight of their massive deception. However, the core lesson embedded in this narrative is that authentic power cannot be stolen, forged, or married into. It is meticulously built through independent, specialized skill and unshakable integrity. Audrey's survival did not depend on waiting for a miraculous apology or hoping the royal family would eventually notice the glaring injustice. Instead, she actively leveraged the very tools she had cultivated throughout her entire professional life: her brilliant forensic accounting expertise and her unwavering self-reliance to methodically dismantle their fraudulent empire. The story powerfully demonstrates that while toxic individuals might try to hijack your financial resources to buy themselves a temporary crown, they can never steal the intrinsic competence and sharp intelligence that generated those resources in the first place. Furthermore, the story teaches us that severing ties with toxic bloodlines is never an act of defeat, but rather the ultimate declaration of self-worth. By refusing to play the obedient victim, Audrey transformed her deepest, most painful betrayal into an unparalleled opportunity to forge a chosen family based on mutual respect, professional equality, and genuine loyalty. We are reminded that our value is never determined by those who blindly exploit us, but by our ability to stand firmly in our truth and rebuild our lives entirely on our own terms. True security relies exclusively on your own capabilities, placing you far beyond the reach of those who only seek to drag you down. Take a moment today to evaluate your own personal boundaries. Invest deeply in your independence and refuse to let anyone else dictate your worth.